the Duke volleyball game, and I don't know, again, we have your son here. If you're okay with this, I'd rather he just let him tell the story of what happened. I think I kind of already prefaced it a little bit.
Yeah.
And then we'll come back to you. I do want to get like your take of how this affected you and why this is. I think this is probably of the three things. This is the one that was most strongly probably got you off the fence to kind of try to make a difference and get into politics in the first place. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it just seems like I know it's a very emotional thing. But I can imagine being the father, and we'll tell the story first so people and have some context. But we got Josh here. Josh, how old are you, by the way?
21.
21. Okay, and you are a student at UVU, correct?
That's right.
Okay, and so I want to take it back. When did that happen? A year and a half ago?
Yeah, it happened late August of 2022.
Oh, so 2 years ago. Okay. Yeah, well, I remember just hearing again the story. Long story short, BYU's playing Duke in volleyball. Big game, very emotional game. I think BYU beat them, but Duke was pretty good. And then all kind of hell broke loose. But you ended up having quite the debacle going on. Why don't you just kind of briefly tell us kind of what happened from your point of view, and then I'll follow up with some questions for you, okay? And this is the first time you've really spoken about this ever. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, cool. Well, tell us what happened.
Well, so it was the opening night of the 2022 women's volleyball season, and I was in the very front row of the student section, right behind the players, and the game went on as normal through the first two sets, and in set 3, an officer went and stood right in front of the student section. Since I had never seen an officer at a game before, I asked him, "What's going on? This is unusual." And he said, "We've heard reports of inappropriate language coming from the student section." And I said, "Well, I haven't heard anything from here, but I'll let you know if I do hear anything." And that was pretty much it. And I talked to the officer briefly in set 4, which was a very convincing win for BYU, which was the match clinching set. And after that, after the game ended, I stayed in the same spot. And
by the way, you knew some of the players or something, right, at BYU?
Yes, 3 players. 3 players I know really well, and one of them I actually grew up with and went to my church seminary class with. And there's another player on the men's volleyball team who's in that same class.
So you just grew up with these guys. So you went to pretty much every game, yeah?
Every game. Like my freshman year, I went to every home game plus an away game. So
cool. All right, so go on.
So the match ends, and I end up staying in pretty much the same spot. Everyone in the stadium leaves. And by the way, it was an attendance record sellout crowd that night in the stadium.
These volleyball games they're rushes.
It's one of the best
it's
college
fun.
volleyball environments in the country.
It's like really tight gym. Like you can see why people could get super intimidated. It's fun. I used to go to them all the time.
Yeah, it's awesome. I still enjoy it. And so about 5 minutes after the match ends, I see a bunch of players in blue walking out of the locker rooms and onto the court. And the players, and for context, BYU was wearing black during the match, but Duke was in blue. But I saw players from both teams coming out of the locker room. All of them were wearing blue. And I was about 8 to 10 feet behind a player in blue, thinking she was one of my friends on BYU's team. But I see someone in Blue Devils gear, like it said Blue Devils, come up to me and in a very confrontational way say, like, "Get away from us." And I realized it was Duke. I go, "Duke," and I went, "Oh, sorry about that," and then just walked away without saying anything because the BYU players had just walked out at about that same moment. So then I did go talk to them after the match.
Saying hi to your friends or what?
Yeah, exactly.
And was that a regular thing for you? Like, did you always stay late for them and go talk to them?
I always did, yeah. Like, I always do that now. I would, after games, I would go hang out with them, with the players on the men's and women's teams who I know, and we go get dinner and that sort of thing. And I still do that after a lot of the games.
Got it.
And so they weren't able to do it because they were celebrating the first one of the season, but so I go to leave. And as I'm leaving the stadium, another police officer stops me, and he says, "Duke was adamant that you were yelling racial slurs the entire match." And I go, "I'm sorry, what what are you talking about? I don't know what you mean. And he said the fan was wearing a yellow shirt and would you mind showing me where you were sitting? I said, yes, I'll show you. And I showed him the front row of the student section, about 6-7 feet away from the players on the bench. And he said, yes, this is exactly where the racial slurs were reported. And this whole time, this officer was taking a very confrontational tone.
By the way, have you ever had a run-in at this point with officers before?
No.
Pretty intimidating.
Yeah.
I've had plenty when I was a kid. I remember one time walking down the street. I was just going to the 7-Eleven with my buddy and back, and an officer stopped us, and he said there'd been, a bunch of break-ins or whatever, and it was like two young guys, and like he was really grilling me, and I was probably 14. I just remember being so intimidated, and if you've never had that experience, like that authority, it's like there's an energy to it that's really intimidating, because like you're afraid to say the wrong thing, you're afraid to they can do whatever they want essentially in that situation, and so I see what I mean. Anyway, I just empathize with that situation because I've had that before.
So what I said to him is, I said I did not use any racial slurs, and I never have. And if I had heard anybody in the student section yelling racial slurs, I would have reported it to you guys immediately. That's all I can say. And then at around that time, the officer who was standing next to me for the second half of the match shows up, and that officer was the supervisor. Mm. And so he told the confrontational officer to leave. So it was just me and the other officer. And then that officer asked me for my student ID. And I told him I was a UVU student.
He was the cop that was kind of standing by you for part of the time?
Yes.
Okay.
And so he asked for my information, which I gave him. And he said, for your own safety, I'm going to escort you off BYU property. And so I agreed. And he asked me if I had a license plate number, if I had a car. I told him no, I just take the bus between campuses because I live by UVU anyway. So he escorted me off BYU property and sent me on my way back to Orem. Mm. So a few hours later, about 5 minutes before midnight, I got a call from BYU. And they said that they had made the decision to ban me.
Wait, what time was it?
11:55.
At night?
At night, yeah.
Oh, gosh, okay.
And they said, we've made the decision to ban you from all BYU athletic events as we begin the investigation. And I was just like, seriously? And they're like, yeah, we're going to, the ban's effective immediately. And I told them I did not use any racial slurs at the match tonight or ever. That's all I know. And so I wake up in the morning and I saw that BYU Athletics had released a statement saying that. And
by the way, this was for those that give context to the listeners, most of you probably remember this, but if not, it became this giant story. Every single news station was talking about it. It was the number one story on ESPN. South Carolina's basketball coach, women's basketball coach, who's the most famous coach in the country, came out and said she was canceling games with BYU. I mean, it was a big deal very fast. So you wake up to this storm going on.
Yeah. So I woke up to that, and it was all over CNN, ESPN, Fox News, ABC, NBC, anything you can think of, everything. And it's definitely a jarring way to wake up.
Take us to the experience of that. What did that feel like to wake up knowing that you hadn't done anything, but yet this was put on you in this moment? Did you think you might be arrested? You were just scared for your safety? What was going on with you emotionally?
I never thought I would be arrested, but I was definitely afraid for my safety of being identified.
Just what that would do to your reputation?
Oh yeah, definitely. And having that branding associated with me.
For sure.
But I got another call from my friends on the volleyball team who I've known for a few years, and they told me that they got my name and that they knew that I was the band fan, and that they said that they stood by me, and that they knew that I was innocent and did not do what I was accused of. And the entire BYU women's volleyball team stood by me through the entire thing.
That's cool. So when did it start to leak that maybe this didn't happen? Because it was pretty quickly. Also, just weird things started coming out. Hold on a second, this doesn't sound like this actually happened. I can't remember the exact timeline. Do you remember exactly what happened next?
Yeah, so it started to leak that the story didn't actually happen about 3 days later. Mm-hmm. And
in the meanwhile, like, what did BYU come out with more statements? They started an investigation, right?
Yes.
So they're basically, I maybe Jason, you know better than this, but how many people, like, how did the investigation go? Well, I actually want to bring you in right here. So, I mean, your son's going through this. I'm sure by this point he's contacted you. Mm-hmm. Like, what's going on in your mind?
Well, the first thing I was thinking is, you got to be kidding me. So it's been a tough couple of years, right? Because
you've already had your issues with BYU.
I mean, we already had the thing with Jessica. Yeah. We were begging BYU to release public statements about her death, and they released nothing anywhere. And then, so secondly, now they're going after my kid who doesn't even go to BYU. And then my daughter is sitting in her classes at BYU listening to her BYU professors rant about this terrible racist kid from UVU. And my daughter has to just eat that. So for our whole family, it was hard. I was actually out of town with my wife at a business trip. Play your violins for me, but we were in Hawaii. Sure. And while we were there, my wife, I was speaking to a couple hundred of our leaders. And when I was finished, Kristen pulled me aside and said, "Here's what's happening." And so I immediately went and watched all the video, and you could just immediately tell from the video, BYU's own video, that what the player was saying couldn't possibly be true, right? So she was saying that the reports I read said that she said that the racial slurs kept escalating.
Well, if I recall, and you know the details, I'm sure better than me because it's a vague story at this point, but like, he would have had to have been yelling past like multiple people on the bench and Duke. And it was just like the logistics of it just didn't add up. I think that's part of why I remember Clay Travis breaking it down and some of these other big, more like conservative voices, I think Glenn Beck, and just people just like, hold on a second. And this kept happening at that time, right? With these false narratives of racism happening. And I'll tell a quick story actually, because I think it's maybe a good place to inject my own experience of this. A couple of years back, it was right before COVID. There was this kid going to Pleasant Grove High School, really good kid, and his black kid, he was adopted from Haiti. And there was a story came out in the news on Salt Lake Tribune of his car had been vandalized, and there was this ongoing just like things happening to this kid and they called it racially motivated. So I'm like getting ready to go to bed. I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me. It's like 10 at night. And I like 100 comments in a row of like, Utah's racist, this is horrible. This is somebody's got to do something about this. And I remember like getting ready to go to bed. I'm like, hey, I think I can do something about this. Like I used to be roommates with a lot of the players at BYU who were black. And we never saw firsthand people just violently or just angrily coming after them. It was more like they were unfamiliar with it, or they just didn't know a lot of black people. I mean, it's a very white state. But I was like, I don't know if this is, but you don't know. It's like you get a couple bad eggs at their school. Yeah, a bunch of racist kids. Like, of course it's happening. So I jump into action. I was friends with the NBA guys at the time, the Jazz players. So I contact Rudy and Donovan and these different guys and, Kyle Van Noy, Fred Warner, some of these big athletes from the NFL. And they all jump in. Everyone wants to help support this kid. And the whole point was just change the narrative, like help this kid so he feels loved and help this city of Pleasant Grove, like get your shit together. It's 2023 or whatever, 19. Why are we still dealing with this, And so we ended up raising all this money. We got he was on the soccer team. We got their whole soccer team cleats, car washes for life. All these business owners in Utah contributed, and we'd raised a bunch of money so I ended up I wanted to meet with the principal of Pleasant Grove so I could see how we could bring everyone together. And by the way, the kid got to go front row in Jazz game. He got the shoes of Donovan, and Rudy bought the tickets. It was just amazing things happening for this kid. It was really cool. It really changed the narrative of the story. But I go to meet, this is the part of the story I don't share very often. I go to meet with the principal of Pleasant Grove, and he's like, hey man, I got to tell you something. Like, this kid's the most popular kid in school. This isn't racism. This isn't a racist thing. It's like, it's a prank war. His dad doesn't know. This has been ongoing with him and his friends back and forth doing stuff to each other for like a long time. And I'm like, what do I do with this? I'm just like, so we were like, whatever, we've raised the money. We've got all these things donated. So we throw this big party at Pleasant Grove High for this kid. And we ended up throwing the party, and I mean, it was like the whole point was to unite this kid and everybody at the school. And the kid didn't even go to the party because the cool kids went to a different party that night and didn't want to go to the party we threw for everybody. And I'm like, wait, this whole story was outrageous and this had nothing to do with race. And like, by the way, the kid's a good kid. His dad jumped the gun and he's a good guy too. But just sometimes we want to think things out, but it's okay to like for people to backtrack and go, hey, actually, you know what? We made a mistake. Like that's not what this was. Because Utah, I think, has this, what's the best way to say this? Like almost like this, what's the word where you're like insecurity. They're like have this insecurity about like, we want to make sure everyone knows we're not racist. And it's like, I really don't think most of racism is kept alive by people trying to claim racism where it's not happening. I think obviously I don't want to minimize that it happens, but like the majority of these incidents we hear, it's just not the case. And so like this was one of those times where you just wish there had been some adults in the room that would said, you know what, a mistake was made. That's it. Let's take care of the people so that this kid doesn't have to live. I mean, by the way, if you meet your son, like he's a very calm individual who it's just somebody he's been stripped of his friend group. He's got to be worried about how he's going to be perceived socially. It's really damning and it can be a huge issue. And so anyway, I just preface that to say like, in this case, obviously at the time you're watching this and discovering that, wait, this didn't happen. Yeah. And so, are you in touch with, BYU? Are you in touch with Tom Holmoe? Are you in touch with?
We're trying to heal as a family member. Our daughter had just taken her life. And then the next December, my brother, who is my creative director, died of a heart attack. He had that heart attack New Year's Eve, 1 year after my daughter. 6 months later, my dad died. And so you're talking for this young man here. Josh, by the way, you are an exceptional young man. There's no father that could be more proud than I am of my son. I love him exactly how he is, and he's just a phenomenal young man. But the kid is suffering. His older sister was like a mother figure to him. Right. My brother Mike that passed away was the uncle or aunt that he was closest to, and my grandfather may have been the person he was closest to. So gone. Sure. Right. And so now here he is trying to get through life, and he gets accused of this. And so this was his friend group, as you pointed out. There were two kids that he went to high school with. One was on the BYU women's team. One was on the BYU men's team. And was his social group. That's who he hung out with. That's who he did things with. And now, all of a sudden, he even is stripped of that. And it was really hard as parents to watch that, knowing that it's happened to maybe the best human being that you've ever known, and that people wouldn't come to his defense. And I think that the dagger was when not just like some of his sports heroes were tweeting terrible things about him, but Governor Spencer Cox, put out there, called him a racist asshole.
The governor did?
The governor did.
Wow.
Yeah. How hurtful is that?
Did he ever retract that?
I think he did, but
but there's something to be said if you're you kind of gotta sit on that for a minute before you. Yeah.
Yeah. You know how you made this 19-year-old feel?
Well, it's kind of funny. I didn't think the conversation was going to be about this, but it goes back to one thing: self-preservation. He's right. Like trying to cover his own ass as the governor of Utah. Throw this kid under the bus. It's just one bad egg. That's and
whether or not he was innocent or guilty.
Sure.
Is it appropriate for
point.
The governor of your state to reach out to one of the college kids in your state that's a resident of your state with no information and call him a racist asshole? That to me is unfit for governance, period.
Yeah. So, all right. So you're dealing with all that and trying to figure out. So at what point did the story finally, because BYU did their investigation and came out and said, we've found no wrongdoing. Yeah. This didn't happen, basically.
We actually pushed that. So I reached out to Tom Holmoe and said, look, with the video evidence, you can clearly see the facts that are coming out in the media it's impossible that they're true. There's no possible way. So you can see that in one of the sets, he wasn't there, and video evidence shows he wasn't there.
So he's I think I remember he was getting some food or something,
and he has
right?
credit card evidence. Yes. Credit card evidence to support that. The last time that the player that accused him was serving, the cameras zoomed in on her and only one student in the background, and it's Josh, and he has his mouth closed, clearly saying nothing. And even the officer said that
I was going to say the officer was standing there during that portion of it even, right?
Yeah. Through different portions of it. So my point is the video evidence alone refuted it. And to your point, he would have had to been yelling racial slurs over the Duke bench team to the person serving. People who he was 4 to 6, 7 feet away from. And then when the officer came and stood there, they had the whole rest of the game to just turn around right behind him. And if they leaned forward, they'd be 1.5 feet from him and say, it was him. It's that guy. But they didn't.
So they do the investigation. They come out and they say, we found no wrongdoing.
What they did at the beginning is I said, please lift the ban. It's causing unbelievable stress on my son. He's already in a tough spot. Mm-hmm. please lift the ban.
The players were doing the same thing too.
Yeah, the BYU players were doing the same thing too. And he said, no, we still have to investigate. And I said, and then so I had to get an attorney involved. And the attorney said, look, let's just be honest. You think it's intentional infliction of emotional distress. And BYU said, yeah, we're still not going to lift it. And then the attorney said, well, you should know that once his name becomes public and there are people who already know who he is, then you go into defamation claims, and his dad owns a business that's worth like a lot.
Yeah.
And then that's when they lifted the ban the next day, after just previously telling us they wouldn't do it. So having all my friends say, hey, isn't it great that they lifted the ban, also stings a little bit. Did they do it because it was the right thing to do and they're protecting him, or did they do it because they realized that there was claims?
So they publicly came out and said they were lifting the ban, that they found no wrongdoing?
Yeah. Like, can I read what they said?
Sure.
So, and by the way, can I just give a shout out to Tom Homo?
Sure.
So Tom Homo reached out and apologized to Josh.
He's the BYU athletic director.
Yeah, he reached out and apologized to Josh twice.
Oh.
And so first he did it on a Zoom meeting, and then Josh.
How long after, right
after they lifted the ban.
Okay.
And then he invited him in, and Josh, maybe you can tell us about what it was like when the invite.
So Tom Homo invited you to come in and kind of apologize, essentially.
Yes. So right after the ban was lifted, he invited me in. And he offered me like season tickets to everything I politely declined. He did, however, give me a BYU athletics jacket that only the student athletes have access to, and I've been able to sit in the student athlete section at some BYU football games, which is I think 3 or 4 rows from midfield.
Wow, awesome. I will say, man, it's a tough position to be put in. You imagine being Tom Homo that day and you first hear the news, right? You're like, you've got to be kidding me. Now I got to deal with this. And so, and there's so many lessons. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I think it's cool that you're sharing the story, Josh, is because there's just a lot to learn here. And I think, Tom is one of those guys that I don't envy the position. I think he does a hell of a job. But imagine getting that call, right? We just had a problem at the Duke game. One of the students was yelling racial slurs. You're just like, oh my gosh. They're trying so hard to build a good reputation, get into the Big 12 and all these things, and you have to deal with that. So there is empathy on all sides. But what I think the lesson here is I guess for me, the lesson is consider everybody involved. Even that kid should have been considered in that moment instead of throwing him under the bus, right? Even if he did, and you said it very well, even if he had done it, there still could be some consideration done there. And especially since he hadn't done it, hadn't even been conclusive that it would have been done. It was just kind of speculation at the time.
Jimmy, I want you to think about, I'm going to tell you what Utah Valley University did. I want you to contrast this to what happened when my daughter passed away on BYU's property. Utah Valley University, when they saw the news that it was a Utah Valley University student, before they had any evidence to say the person was innocent, they got together at the highest levels and they said, this kid's going to need counseling because they're getting eviscerated by the media, just destroyed.
Wow.
It's got to be unbelievably damaging psychologically, which it was and is. And so he went to the dean of student life, and the dean of students actually walked him physically to the counseling session that they had already prearranged before we told him that he was a student. How cool is that?
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really
Utah
cool.
Valley, the way you do anything is the way you do everything. But let's contrast that with what BYU did. BYU calls him at almost midnight so they can inform him that he's banned, so that they can annihilate him in the press the next day and say it wasn't a BYU student. It was, and then they kept sharing more and more personal information about him as time went on. Them and the Deseret News.
Well, thank goodness, by the way, though, that there was enough things that were off on this story, because I remember when the story broke. Now, again, I swear I was the first one tweeting this is bullshit.
You were. That's why we're here again today. You were the first and only one that stood up for him, and you and I had not talked about it.
No, I didn't know it was your son till a month later, know. But ultimately, I was just no, this is wrong. And it was cool though to see all these national people, because the story did. Well, and there's two parts of this. The story did get very clear by the end of it that this didn't happen. But even then, there was people that wouldn't admit, I think people were just well, we're still going to stand by what our players said or whatever, I think is what Duke said or something like that. And so you're wait a second, you know, and I get it. Like, it's really hard to admit that you lied about something and that it was a really serious thing to lie about, you know, but you see this more and more. Like, I think the Johnny Depp trial was a good example of this. It's a guy that got eviscerated for what happened. And then you hear it in court and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing was a setup, you know? And then you've got the Jesse Smollett thing that happened, right? And it's like, hold on a second. This keeps happening. And it's like, I'm glad that there was those kids. What was the case where they kept trying to say they were being racist? You know what I'm talking about?
That was Covington Catholic.
Covington, yeah. And they got sued for a lot of money and they won. And then you had the Chiefs fan, that kid that's like 9 years old, and they tried to say he was racist. You know, you guys might want to look into it. I don't know. Well, I'm just saying, like, these things, like, but my point is I'm glad that like some of these lawsuits have happened now, so people can just take a step back, and like consider like what's going on as opposed to, you know, the reality. I love that. Have you heard Dave Chappelle when he talks about Jesse Smollett?
Yes.
He's like, people were mad because black people weren't supporting. It's like, because we knew exactly what happened. He's just like, it's so good. It's his Netflix special. I've never laughed so hard, but I just think there's, you know, like, this can't keep happening. Like, there's I can't imagine your poor son, like when he was going through that. Like, at that age, I mean, I take heat every now and then for something I'll say that, you know, wasn't even that, like just talking about ayahuasca or something on my podcast, and I'll take heat and it's uncomfortable. You're like, wait, don't come at me. You don't even know me. And then all of a sudden to be that age and have national stories all over the place.
They're totally fake.
That's a lot of heat.
Yeah, it's a lot of heat. And it lasted for a long time. He actually still stands accused by Duke.
Oh, yeah, I guess.
So still to this day. So here's what Tom Homo said when they lifted the ban. Tom Homo said, we reached out to more than 50 individuals who attended the event, from fans and BYU personnel to Duke's players and team staff. That sounds like everyone cooperated, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it does.
It's very carefully done. From our extensive review, we have not found any evidence to corroborate the allegation that fans engaged in racial heckling or uttered racial slurs at the event. So it might have been a good idea, since you totally tore him apart in all the accusations, if you like listed all of the evidence that showed that it wasn't him, for like to say there's actually video evidence that shows that this isn't possible. There's other evidence of this that shows this isn't possible. The people sitting right next to the fan, there was a BYU police officer standing right there that didn't hear it. And in the video, there's also a Duke assistant athletic director that nobody's talked about yet, because he's standing in the back right behind where Josh is, and he's in a blue shirt. You assume he's BYU, but it's Scott Mosier. Assistant Duke Athletic Director Scott Mosier. So I'm told that's who it is. So here's how Nina King responds. It's almost to me
as Nina King?
She's the Duke Athletic Director.
Got it.
So Tom Homo basically says, we reached out to over 50 people, including the coaching staff and players of both teams. Nina King says this: we unequivocally stand behind with and champion them, especially when their character is called into question.
Like basically saying that she was lying.
She's saying that. She's saying that the kid we identified said those racial slurs. Duke and so Duke athletics believes in respect, equality, and inclusiveness, and we do not tolerate hate and bias. What a hypocritical thing to say. What about the hate and bias to my son? And what about the hate and bias to the state of Utah? It wasn't just Josh who was and still stands slapped in the face. It's the entire state of Utah, as you pointed out, right? And so,
because like, it's funny. There's the Atlanta bomber, right? The overweight guy. I can't remember his name, but anyway.
Jewell?
Yeah, thank you, Richard Jewell. Yeah, you got your history, bro. Nice work. I was talking as I watched the movie. Did you watch the movie? It came out a few years ago about it.
Yeah.
As I'm watching it, I remembered him being the bomber. Like, he was innocent, but because the news turned that story so badly. That's what the movie's about, is this poor dude that got obliterated by the news. And I still thought he had done it. Like, even as I just talked about trying to get the guy's name, I said the Atlanta Olympic bomber. Like, I still called him that, the poor guy. And I think he's dead now or whatever. Like, that's terrible. Like, it's really hard to shake those once the news is like called you, and once the governor has called you something, once these things have happened, it's really hard to shake that for the rest of your life even, you know.